And our topic today is surrounding emotional intelligence. No, not emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence. Spiritual intelligence is the topic that we cover on Sundays. And actually, I feel a little nervous about today. I typically, and ever since I started the Knowing Show a couple months ago, Sundays have been where I have felt probably the most stretched and the most uncomfortable because my spirituality has been so personal and private for me over the last decade or so. Um, but I just felt really led to talk about spirituality today after growing up in a very conservative Christian environment. And this conversation is more so focused for those who grew up in a similar environment and just leaning into some of the pain that I have seen a lot of others struggle with, encounter some of the pain I've encountered as I've moved through my own kind of story and engagement with spirituality and my relationship with God ever since. And so this is what we're going to talk about tonight. I just want to take a moment before we dive in. I've done this on a couple of shows, and frankly, most of the time when I have a guest join me, I just take a moment to do this with them. So if you're here and you're going to join me for this conversation, I welcome you to enter into this little process that I move into with each guest and that I'm just going to move into right now. This is such an important topic this Sunday, this October 19th. It's so important. And spirituality is something that for so many of us we ignore. It's something that we don't really touch on, and if we do, it's like within the confines of a very compartmentalized portion of our life, and it's not extending and permeating throughout the rest of it. And so I just want to honor this conversation because for so many of us, this is the one time a week or one time out of very, very few others where we are actually engaging on this topic. So I am going to literally close my eyes and just take a couple deep breaths, and I'm just going to say a quick prayer. And you're welcome to join me or just wait until I'm done, and then we will resume the conversation. One of the benefits of doing this for me is that I really just all of a sudden I become super present. I become keenly aware of the sensations in my body. I just become aware of the noises around me and I realize what a gift this is, this present moment. And even just here as I'm taking a couple deep breaths and just even recognizing how I feel, I feel this like discomfort in my stomach and this semblance of honor because I know that this conversation, this topic is one that has caused so much pain for so many. It is one that so many have given their life to. And it's one that is so, so incredibly important. And so I'm just asking God for your help tonight. I don't want to hide. And I pray that every single person hearing this, listening to this, going to listen to this, I pray that they would feel really, really loved right now. And throughout this entire conversation, love is the goal. Love is the point. God, may this conversation bring healing to every single one of us having this conversation and many more to come. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I wanted to talk tonight about just the evolvement that takes place from growing up a certain way, believing certain things, having told to you and handed to you what is how you should think and live and breathe and move and act, and then coming to our own belief systems and coming to our own opinions and our own preferences, and really establishing a semblance of belief around what feels true and right for us versus what was handed to us. And it's such a hard path. It's so painful, and for so many, I just am seeing more and more folks who, it's like in their 30s, 40s, 50s, they're more lost than when they were 10, 20. and and when I say lost, it's like there's a sorrow there. There's, so perhaps even lost isn't the right word. Perhaps it's, I'm seeing more and more people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who are just sad, and there's a hopelessness. And I think that's actually the better word. Is it's not a lostness, it's perhaps actually a contentment in the hopelessness, yet hopelessness nonetheless. And there's a very strong disassociation with how they were raised, because so much of how they were raised is really angering and upsetting to them. And I guess maybe that's the first point that I want to speak to tonight. And y'all, I got to tell you, I feel so nervous talking about this because I know, one, I'm young, and I know that there's so many more life experiences that I'll go through that will further round out and shape out this whole ability to even talk about this. I know in so many ways I grew up very privileged to have grown up with two parents who loved me. And I know that that's so rare for so many people. And I feel the just so grateful for that. And I feel the immense amount of, honestly, privilege in that. One of the retreats I held, knowing retreats back last year, someone mentioned that their dad left them at 6 months old. And I just, man, it's so devastating. In some ways, it's so devastating. And in another way, you read the stories of all the greats, and each one of them had something tragic happen to them under 12 years old. And then that shaped the way that they led, and that shaped the story that catalyzed them to be the greatest inventors of all time, the greatest leaders of all time. And so there's such a degree of empathy held for folks who have gone through so much pain. And there's also this almost like, okay, well, the phoenix is going to rise so long as we choose. Man, and even as I think about this, honestly, I had my first real devastation shortly after I got married, when I was 20 years old. And I had lived a very pain-free life up until then. And so in one sense, there's a major setback because I didn't know how to deal with tough. I had to figure that out. And now by the time I'm 30, 32 now, it's like, okay, I'm finally kind of gaining my bearings over how to deal with pain and trauma and loss and grief and everything in between. And so if you have something devastating happen to you when you're a child, you're so much more well equipped to encounter and engage with the world. And also, if you don't and you're preserved like I was, there's so much love and just like a sweetness and innocence that comes with that. And so there's pros and cons to both. So I don't want to engage with a pity nor a victim mentality if we have engaged with pain on an earlier scale, or if we've engaged with pain in a latter scale, in a later term of life, right? Like the latter is my example of, at 20 years old, was the very first time I knew grief and pain. And then it continued to unfold in various manifestations throughout my adult life. But either way, you can look at it from either side. The 9-year-old encountering grief knows how to engage with the pain and letting down that this world just continues to give us. Or you can be 20 years old and learning how to be an adult and face pain for the first time, which is better. And at the same time, I think it's actually really important, even in asking that question, which is better, perhaps neither one is. And it's truly the honoring of the story that's handed to all of us. I had this thought as I was driving home about 6 months ago. If I was to author a great story with with you as a heroine or hero, with your friend as the hero, heroine, with me as the hero, heroine, what would I actually put me through? What would I put you through if I was the great author to get you to where you are today, to get you to where you will be 60 years from now, having fulfilled on your greatest potential? And when we think about it that way, honestly, when I had that thought, I got so excited because I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Everything I've been through, like I really have come to love who I am today. And even in saying that, man, what a gift. What a gift, because the way we were raised, we as in, this is for the person who grew up in a Christian conservative environment, we were raised to have this aversion to ourselves in every regard. Don't think about yourself. Don't look at yourself in the mirror. Don't like yourself. And not even in a neutral basis. It was like, actually, think less of yourself. Actually, you're evil. Actually, you're sinful. Actually, you're ugly. And God should hate you. But thank God he doesn't. It's only by his grace that you're saved. And I actually don't want to go down a theological road right now. That's not the point. The point is that with that type of education, because there's spiritual education, there's emotional education, intellectual education. Every single one of our intelligences, from the time we're entering into this world, we're being taught how to engage with each one of these intelligences as they relate to us. And so for me, in a spiritual context, I was raised to think that I am not to be trusted. I am to effectively dislike every part of who I am, and I am only ever to focus on others. And in that molding, it really set me up for a very dangerous engagement with the world at large, because I was handed this script of effectively be a non-person in your own story. Don't pay attention to you, don't believe you, focus on everyone else. And so as a byproduct, I was very, very fixated on everyone else to validate me, and very fixated on their happiness as a metric of my worth. So if anyone else was ever unhappy, then I clearly was failing. And what that did was that it effectively put me in like a ball and chain with every single person close to me. So their emotions were the indicator of my own success. Their success was a reflection of whether I was doing my job. And especially in a romantic relationship, that typically shows up in a very codependent way. And codependency, I actually read this in a book, I guess about 4 years ago. A therapist gave it to me, and the title is called Is It Me? And this talks about how, I believe it's 1/4, so 25% of all Christian women are in a narcissistic, codependent type of relationship. And they're talking about this book was for the Christian woman. So I read this shortly after my marriage, and it was every single woman, if you look down the pew at church, 1 in every 4 women is in this type of emotionally abusive marriage. And it's so dangerous because the Christian woman is effectively trained to be this codependent, fixated on everyone else, having such disassociation with their own selves that there is no semblance of self from which to then operate and engage with the world at large. And what I found was, in so doing, I was existing as a phantom in my own reality. I was existing as if you think about my life as a story, we were talking about that earlier. Like, if you were to author a great story with you as the hero or you as the heroine, what part are you actually currently playing in your own story, in your own life? And for so much of my life, I actually was like as close to the edges and circumference of the narrative, and putting everyone else as the hero, whether it was my dad or my husband or my sisters or anybody else to fill in the limelight. And I'm like, okay, how do I support this person? But the danger with that is that in so doing, I'm putting them at the pinnacle of the mountain that I am effectively supposed to be at. And so, of course, I'm going to be disappointed. Of course, I'm going to be let down. Of course, it's never going to feel like enough. Of course, all these different scenarios because these people have an improper place in my life and I have put them on that pedestal. I have put them at the pinnacle of the mountain. And we're all doing that for so long as we are ignoring our own selves. And the reason why this is so important, y'all, is because in our church growing up, there was this mantra: God first, others second, me third. But by the time you get through God and then you get through others and then you get to you, by the end of your 9 to 5 plus everything thereafter, you've got nothing left for you. And so in my adult life and even in throughout childhood, I was just non-existent for the most part because I was told at a very, very young age that I was this horrifying little person, and it is only by the grace of God that he likes you, and thank him and give him everything that give him all of you. And what that did was that when I ended up having pain to any level, so pain in my marriage, when my brother-in-law was killed when I was 21, I just had this severe disassociation with myself already formed throughout my early childhood. And then when I got married at 20 and then started struggling in my marriage and then had my brother-in-law die at 21, I just felt so, oh gosh, it's hard to even put into words. There were so many aspects in my marriage. I thought, okay, well, if I can just become perfect enough, then I will earn the love. I will earn the affection. If I can just be better. So that was kind of the narrative in the marriage. The narrative with my brother-in-law being killed, I actually felt this semblance of betrayal from God. So the people that we put on the pedestal, when anything negative happens to us, it's like, well, I'm doing this for you, so then you're supposed to do this for me. It's very transactional. And so what my brother-in-law being killed revealed to me was that I had held a very transactional relationship with God since the very beginning. Okay, God, like, I will give you everything. I will do everything for you. You'll be my number one, and then you will keep me and my family safe. And I didn't even know that I thought that until this accident happened. And I really felt like God had betrayed me. And he was the person that was supposed to keep everything fine. And it's funny because intellectually, I knew that that wasn't true. I saw people around me get cancer, and I saw, even I remember in high school, one of my dearest friends, she lost her dad to ALS, and it wasn't like they did anything wrong, but there was something growing up in the church that I was raised in where it was like, if someone is sick, what sin did you commit? And you actually even read that in the Bible. There's a story of the Jesus Christ is existing in an environment where his disciples, he has 12 close followers, and they say they notice somebody who's sick. I think he's blind. And they say, "Hey, Jesus, is that guy blind because of his sins or because of his parents' sins?" And so effectively, that attribution of physical ailment was at the time to someone making a mistake. And Jesus responded with, actually, it's neither one. This sickness has nothing to do with someone's sin. But growing up, there was very much so an association. If something is wrong in your life, it's probably because you did something bad. And therefore, there was this semblance of, let me never do anything wrong so that then nothing externally goes wrong. So if I'm okay in here, everything out there will be fine. And it was a very subconscious, very subtle belief system that kind of infiltrated everything until all of a sudden one morning you wake up and receive the most devastating news of your life. And all of a sudden your sister, loses her person, and you've got this 3-week-old baby girl, and it's so It's funny that we're even talking about this. I wasn't planning to, but my sister sent me this picture just probably 30 minutes ago. And it's right around the time that I met my niece. I don't know if you can see, but like she's so smushy. This is right when this is, months after she moved back. And so my sister sent me this tonight. And I just look at my baby niece and she never knew her daddy. And so then you can ask the question, was it her sins? Was it my sister's sins? Was it Nate's sins? But man, it's so interesting because that line of questioning, it's so devastating as you follow it all the way through to the logical conclusion, because then you're just constantly chasing the external. You're constantly chasing doing the right thing, and you're constantly chasing making everybody happy, and you're constantly chasing something to fill this pain that is so deep within you. Because man, if you could read my journal from those 6 years after my brother-in-law was killed, where I was just so broken, how is it possible that we now, like our family, there will always be one less seat at the table forever, you know? And how then will we go on? And I actually write about this at the very introduction of my book, Knowing, this question of how then will I live? The then is predicated on something happened. How then will I live? And that question for me at that time when I wrote the book, I was 28 years old when my husband left, and it was like, okay, well, how then am I going to live after this loss? But it was all of that loss with my former husband was sitting on top of a lot of unresolved wounds when my brother-in-law was killed. And so much of it was, okay, God, I've got to have it out with you. I have to contend with you. When my former husband and I first got married, I was 20, he was 23, and I'd been going to a church my entire life, and he didn't want to go there because he didn't really know everyone and I knew everyone. And so we started kind of church shopping, but within the year, or I guess just a few weeks after the first year of our anniversary, my brother-in-law was killed, and honestly at that point I had zero desire to go to church. And we would sometimes step foot in a church, and I just, oh gosh, it was so painful sitting in the back watching watching the pastor talk or watching people greet each other and just feeling so incredibly devastated. Church was actually the last place I wanted to be. It just felt like no one else had really been through a depth of pain, and if they did, it wasn't shown. It's one thing to be like wearing your scars on you versus it's been so long, or you've healed them so well maybe that they don't show. But I just felt like I was walking into church and I was exposed, battered, and bruised, and everyone around me looked perfectly fine, and I was just like, get me the hell out of Dodge. Like, I do not belong here. I don't want to be here. And at the same time, most of the Christians that I was encountering were telling me the very thing that I already knew. They were telling me, oh, well, just trust God. He has a plan. It was obviously God's timing that your brother-in-law was killed. All these things that, oh man, it was more upsetting to hear them say that than to simply have someone sit in the grief. And there's something actually in the Jewish culture which I have found so profoundly beautiful, which is called Shiva. And I believe it's a minimum of 7 days, but it can last, I believe it can last up to 18 months, where effectively the first 7 days after someone dies is you just sit in the ashes with them. And you draw the drapes, close blinds, you cover up the mirrors for so many people, depending on the extent of the loss. No music, nothing. Everyone wears black, and you literally sit for 7 days. And the family of the bereaved, the bereaved family actually is unable and not allowed to do anything. So the community brings food, the community cooks and cleans and tends to them, like truly tends to them in such a caring way. And I found, within 3 days of losing my brother-in-law, I had to go back to work. And I worked at a church. There was no bereavement plan. There was nothing set in place for so much loss and so much brokenness. There was no system in place to really tend to and care for our family. I will always remember the folks who showed up at my house. It literally within hours. My, we all went back to, well, I don't necessarily want to get into it, but I'll always remember, the people who were there. And I will always remember the questions I asked God and just the anger that was there. And what that did was that it exposed to me how much I had lived in the construct and within the box of if this, then that logical sequencing. If I am good, then God will X, Y, and Z. If I behave, if I obey, every bit of my external life was actually predicated on my own behavior. And I really thought that I could effectively predict the outcome based on my own good doing, my own good deeds. And the church, the church that I grew up in, and the Christianity and spirituality that I held at the time really facilitated that belief system, And what's funny is that at its core, it was, you're so sinful, you're so evil. And the way that narrative specifically manifested in my marriage, and the reason why I actually think it's really important to get into specific narratives and their specific manifestations is it's actually very much so in alignment with the knowing framework. When I was cultivating the knowing framework in the years after, it's easier to kind of look back and be like, how did I start believing the things what was the real change that took place? What were the shifts in these beliefs? And in hindsight, I look back to the last 4 years and I see the shifts that took place, and it kind of came into being of the knowing framework. And it was these core narratives surrounding the core experiences and moments in time that then shape who I am today. So the 3 questions of the knowing framework is, well, who was I? Second, who am I? And then third, who do I want to be? So in order for us to understand the past, I need to go back and explore, well, who was I? What are the core narratives that were given to me? What were the core narratives and also experiences, moments, memories that really solidified those narratives into mindsets that today are governing and guiding my behavior, my beliefs, my actions into who I am now? And then who do I want to be? What of those beliefs, mindsets, behaviors actually need to go or change or be adjusted, which actually need to be nurtured and cultivated in order to get me to where I want to go? So it's past, present, future. But in order to actually get to something new, I need to understand, where am I today? What's my actual the coach of Lance Armstrong, Dr. Jeff Spencer. He and I sat down and had a session together, and he said he called it the goal positioning setting, I guess, GPS. Like, we have to figure out, what's my starting line? Where am I? At what point in the race am I shining up? What's my starting line today in the present moment, from which now the gunshot fires go, and now I'm starting on my way? If I don't actually have a clear benchmark of defining what that is, I have no way to measure success if I don't measure, where am I today? And so in order to measure where we are today, it is so incredibly paramount that we understand the past and how that shows up now, in order to then say, okay, in order for me to chart my course based on my vision, which way do I need to go in order to get there? Well, where am I starting from? And so this whole knowing framework, this question of, what are those narratives? Who was I that really shape who I am today? Me being able to go back and trace back to those narratives. One narrative, which is this Bible verse that was handed to me when I was a kid: your heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? That narrative showed up in my marriage. So when I did this work of, well, who was I? Who am I? Who do I want to be? When I did this work 3 years ago, when I was really understanding, how did the past influence and show up in my marriage, I saw that I fundamentally distrusted my intuition. I was so far removed from my sense of self, from my own being, my own body, to know when it had something intuitively to tell me, whether it was my own intuition or God. Either one, I was so like literally, that's when I think of disassociation, that's what that is. I was disassociated from my own voice, from the voice of God in me, because I was trained to believe that I myself, I have nothing good to offer. I am deceitful, my heart is evil, and therefore everything outside of me, they're the ones that say what is true. And man, that was incredibly dangerous. And there's a lot more. Again, this isn't a theological study, but what this is really important to realize for all of us who grew up in the church, I've heard time and time again, so many folks had that similar narrative. So then the question is, okay, if that's what was taught to me, how is that showing up today? What then is my ideal? What do I want it to be instead? Because if we don't set a new target, we're going to end up doing a 360. So, okay, so if I was trained to be disassociated from my body, if I was trained to be disassociated from my intuition, ultimately disassociated from the voice of God, how then do I regain association? And not even just regaining association, what should that relationship with my own intuition look like? What does it feel like? What is the new target? And really clearly outlining that so that now we can pursue something else instead of repeating history all over again. Until we set a new target, we will inevitably repeat that which we know. So we have to set a new goal. We have to come to know something other than the past in order to then show up differently in the future. And so with this whole conversation around, what are those core narratives? That was one for me that just made such a massive impact. Another one was, if then this, then that. So if I behave a certain way, then God will fulfill in how I want him to treat me and how I want him to show up and what I want him to do. And even as I say that, man, it's just so controlling. And the thing that's funny is that, not funny, ironic, is that I grew up very much so seeing that happen. It was very predictable, the life that I lived and the behavior that happened and the actions that took place until I got into my marriage and until Nate was killed. All of a sudden now there's other people involved in the story. When I found myself in a marriage at 20 years old, all of a sudden I just felt so powerless. Like, what in the world do I need to do to make this beautiful and good and everything that I want it to be? But in so doing, it was, what do I need to do rather than how do we create something together? And so there was a fundamental control there that actually is very tied to codependency. In one sense, codependency is such a dangerous mask because we're so fixated on the other person, but we truly believe that we have complete control and power to change them, to change the dynamic. And it's so dangerous. And I see that show up in all these different ways. Even still, like, I've really been working on that, and it's made some pretty big changes over the last few years, but I still see it manifesting, because if you've been cultivating a type of behavior for 30 plus years, it's going to take some time to uproot it. And I love, James Allen talks about, he's the author of As a Man Thinketh. He talks about our mind being like a garden. And with every single narrative, with every single thought, it's planted. We've watered it, sowed to it, shown sunlight on it, and it's been tended to in the garden of our minds. And so if we're going to uproot a thought, uproot a behavior, uproot a belief, we need to put a new one in its stead. So that's why the knowing framework, who was I, who am I, who do I want to be? The last one, who do I want to be, is so critically important, because if all we're doing is just uprooting things and never planting something new in its stead, we're just going to end up doing the 360 rather than a lateral 180. So this element of really diving deep into, what is my ideal? What is the ideal specifically in relation to God? And not just my ideal, but what is really true? And so when we think about control, I've really had to allow myself to strip away the narratives that The narratives that I have found to be inconsistent, the narratives that I found to be not true, and even though I don't have something new to replace them with yet, even just recognizing and being open to the fact that, I think I might have been wrong. That immediately positions me to be open and have something new to come, whether it's a revelation from God or honestly, a revelation about God from somebody else. But it's been really, really beautiful because in that kind of admittance of, I don't know, that's allowed for so much. Man, I keep telling my mom this. I was like, I feel like who God is, like the lid keeps blowing off on who I think God is. Like I keep putting him in a box and I don't mean to, but that's how my mind still is thinking black and white. Like even though I try so hard to not think that way, that's my predisposition. That's my tendency, is to be binary, to be black and white, to be controlling. And it's like, oh my gosh, but it's a work in progress. And in so doing, as I'm continuously looking to, it's like moving from being tightly grasped on anything and just being open handed. At the beginning of 2024, I just felt like I saw in my mind's eye this picture of like this person standing at the top of a mountain with like hands open, arms open, legs open, just like standing, like even just like completely, like it wasn't like a sexual thing at all, but they just were completely open. Like they didn't have any clothes on. They were just like completely open and like ready to receive. And actually, the Greek word of receive is lambano. And lambano means this ability to like receive energy, good things coming in, but it's a very active word. In the receiving, it comes back out. It's the receiving in and of itself is thus a giving. And that's when I say we have to know, knowing, when I say that word, it's very similar to lambano. It's like it's a very active type of knowledge. It's not just sitting in our minds, it's actually producing real change. Because if we know something, we've really come to truly experience it, we cannot help but change as a result. So if we truly receive something, man, it like extends back out through us because it has had its full impact. It's had its full effect on us, rather than just sitting there on our laurels being like, okay, give it to us. It's like, no, I'm active in the receiving to allow it to transform me. And then I give it as an extension of me and who I am. And so as I think about narratives from my past, from my Christian upbringing that have felt inconsistent or felt off or felt wrong, honestly, there was a big fear even in the last 18 months. There has been an element where I'm like, I have felt scared to question things because I don't know what will happen. What will I end up believing? What will happen to me? What will happen in my relationship with God? And that's actually always been something, like I haven't gone to church consistently since I was 20 years old. So it's been over a decade of me doing that. And for so many Christians, they're like, "What? Like you're not a Christian?" And I'm like, I actually, the label in and of itself, it really means nothing to me because the relational aspect of who I have experienced God to be is so precious, so much more than any church service has ever offered me. Me knowing God to the extent that I do and that I hope to continue to do is something that I will forever and always cherish and will always be probably the most important thing in my life. And in that, you know, as I've let go of in the last 18 months, let go of even the fear of like, but what happens if ever I lose that relationship with God? It's like, okay, well, I have to believe in the power of love and the love that I have for him and the love that he has for me. And that love allows for me to let go of beliefs or behaviors or actions that I know deep within that are dangerous, or things that I actually don't really believe, but that I've always been too afraid to question. So in love, we can be open-handed. In love, we can explore what is real, what is true. God, what do you think about this? Because the more I lean into God, what do you think about this? The more I just get this sense of like, I actually think that there's a lot in the church that's not right. Why is it that the church is the last place I wanted to be when I was most broken? And when I say church, I just mean categorically religious people, and religious people, gosh, I mean, I was on a call a couple weeks ago with actually my brother Jared. He was on the Knowing Show on a Sunday, and he's the only guest I've ever had on a Sunday. And it was just such a powerful conversation. And that morning I had gone to church. I was like, "Oh, I'm just gonna give it a shot." And I just felt like I just felt kind of compelled to go. And so I went, and I was in church, and I was just like, "Oh, this feels so lifeless." Like, oh, who would want to follow God if you come into this place? It feels so dead. And they sit around talking about, "Oh, if you follow God, you have to, like, what do they say? Pick up your cross, and it's full of grievance and full of drudgery." And I'm just like, this is awful. Who wants that? The God I know and love is so full of life, and it's so exciting, and it's this adventure every day where, man, I just love to be on a mission, and I love to love people, and it's exciting and fun, and I don't know. So I mentioned that to my brother, and he very, very, very gently, and not even to me, he did it in such a sophisticated way. He was like, "It's so funny. I find that so often the things that really upset us often are a mirror for us." And I was like, "Yep, I know exactly what you mean." And yes, they were a mirror for me. Like, now I actually am triggered by the religious people. The very people that I feel like I'm almost afraid. It's fear. I'm afraid that I'll be like that again. I'm afraid that I'm going to go back and suddenly lose everything, all the progress that I've made, or whatever you want to call it. There's just such a distinct difference when we're operating in fear versus operating in love. And we see it in biblical texts where the Pharisees were so afraid of losing their power to Jesus, who was so winsome, and he had so much love that he attracted everybody to him. Whereas the religious leaders were so fear-based and fear-driven that they effectively created a divide in just their own presence and being, because it was either you're for us or you're against us. And Jesus was like, "No, no, like, this is an entirely different way of existing, which is love." And in that kind of love that Jesus embodied, that he has effectively said that everybody has access to, there's an open-handedness there. So when I am engaging with religion or spirituality predicated in fear, there's a closed fistedness. There's an inability to really listen. There's an inability to engage with other people's experience. There's an inability to even sit with the reality of my own experience. Because if I'm unwilling to even realize my own experience, and this is how I existed for 6 years after my brother in law was killed, I would not acknowledge to anyone else the depth of pain I was in. And there was something about that. There's different reasons why the pain, we give into the fear or give into the pain. And that really is so up to you and me doing the work to ask why and answer honestly. And sometimes it might take a number of times asking why and really leaning in and creating the space. I talk about space a lot. Create the space for you to go in and ask that hard question, and ask it over and over and over again, and journal on it, and really meditate on it, and close your eyes and eliminate all inputs. Turn off music, turn off podcasts, just sit there with an empty piece of paper and just journal. And some of the questions, just for those of you listening, a question that I've asked myself that has been so helpful for me to uncover the truth is, what do I wish were true? And then I just start writing, I wish that. And the more that I just write, I wish that, and I write down all the little things, I wish that my hair was blonde, whatever it is, feeling as silly as it ever could be, allowing ourselves to really get down to the subconscious layers of what has been suppressed for however long, perhaps decades, perhaps even just a few months. It doesn't matter how long. The goal is that we're accessing the subconscious parts of us that lie beneath the water, underneath where we see the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole bunch more down beneath. And in that process, in allowing ourselves space, we really get to know why, and we understand the root of the fear. so that we can really go back to the root and pull it up and then replace it with something new. So, with that, for those of you who are examining relationship with the divine, relationship with God, I've found it so incredibly important to first go back to the origin of your faith, to the origin of those experiences that have shaped you on a spiritual level. What do you believe? What do I believe? And really lean into why. Why do I think that? Is that what I think? Or is that what was handed to me? Because apart from intentional and intentional direction and insight and exploration, we find that so much of our existing belief system is predicated in the belief of our parents, our pastors, popes, priests, you name it. And it's not really ours. Only after we adopt it for ourselves, only after the excavation of our self, soul, and spirit, and come to really create this system of belief systems, then do we say, okay, that's what I believe, at least for now. It might evolve and likely will over time. And then we really can be proud of the actions and behaviors as a result of those belief systems, because the belief systems are ours. Therefore, our actions are really ours. But if our behaviors are predicated in beliefs that are not ours to begin with, there is a fundamental disassociation and abdication of responsibility for them, because the beliefs aren't ours in the first place. Therefore, our behaviors, they're not really ours either. Only after we assume radical responsibility to do the work, to uncover and excavate the self, soul, and spirit, to understand the beliefs that are there, define new ones for ourselves, or further cultivate those that are there that we really do want to now adopt as ours, then do our behaviors hold that much more power and potency in the world around us. With that, I wanted to thank you for joining me on the Knowing Show tonight. I have a couple of workshops coming up October 30th, November 20th, December 18th, and we're diving deep into all things knowing you, knowing your brand and your mission, setting you up for 2026. So I will drop those dates in the chat here. And if you would like to attend, want more information,